Ocarina of Time is a very important game to me, being the first Zelda game that I ever played, and one of the first games that I ever beaten as a child. I poured hours into this game, just roaming around Hyrule Field on my 3DS. I'd like to make it clear though that I've never actually played Ocarina of Time on an authentic N64, rather I grew up with the 3DS remake released in 2011. About a couple months ago, I just decided to pick it up and replay it again, using the fan-made PC port known as the Ship of Hyrcanian. Any and all footage you see of the release game running is actually from the fan-made PC port, rather than on an authentic N64 emulator or any sort of that stuff, so yeah. Ocarina of Time is nothing short of a miracle when it comes to game development, being released back in November of 1998 and being one of the first of many games to come out during the transition from 2D to 3D. The game went through so many stages of development starting back in 1995 with the introduction of the Nintendo Ultra 64 being announced at Space World 95 and even showing a tech demo of the game that showed off the Ultra 64 hardware. Ocarina of Time wouldn't actually be called Ocarina of Time, rather it'd be called Zelda 64 by both fans and game magazines at the time. Hell, even Nintendo adopted the name as every game coming out during that time was given the 64 treatment, Pilot Wing 64, Doom 64, Wave Race 64, etc. Technically, the game originally started development back in '94 using the Super Nintendo Entertainment System's FX chip. However, due to hardware limitations and the Nintendo 64 already being the planning stage, they decided to scrap the idea and just wait for better hardware. Zelda 64 actually started work using the same engine as Super Mario 64, as they were being developed at the same time. However, how many changes that were made to Zelda 64's engine, it became its own engine completely. Think how Gold Source uses the source code from Quake, however, it's a completely different game entirely. Zelda 64 actually started out as somewhat of a retelling of Zelda 2, featuring a fully explorable town and this NPC you can talk to. No one knows what she was supposed to do, she's just here. We can also see that the HUD originally was supposed to use the A and B buttons for items, similar to that of past Zelda titles, like Link's Awakening and A Link to the Past. On the B button, we can actually see what looks like a durability system on the shield, something we wouldn't see until Skyward Sword, wouldn't be fleshed out until Breath of the Wild, or it looks like you could get around 1,000 rupees or so, which the only other game I can think of that knows that is Breath of the Wild and its sequel, Tears of the Kingdom. Link's design is very different here, resembling his old NES counterpart rather than the Link to the Past design we had seen in previous games like A Link's Awakening. That also looked very different at this time, with more Stalfos around rather than the large variety of enemies that we saw in the release game. Speaking of enemies, the Iron Knuckle looks extremely different in this version, spreading much more shiny armor and much less detail from what we got in Ocarina of Time. Honestly, it kinda looks like the enemy Link fights in the tech demo shown off in Space World 95. Entering 1997, the game's art direction had become somewhat more finalized, with little changes to items and Link's figure looking more like what we had gotten in the base game. However, for some reason, Link was still an adult at this time. Yeah, as it turns out, that whole time mechanic that the game is so well known for, now even named after, actually wasn't implemented until pretty late development. Around this time, a release date would be announced. Zelda 64 would be released in late 1997. Yeah, that never happened. Zelda fans would have to wait another year and a half to get Ocarina of Time, as it would finally come out in November of 1998 in Japan and North America. Now, I think that's all there. You're kidding me. So, as it turns out, Nintendo had actually made more cartridges for Ocarina of Time, then went back into the source code and made a couple changes to them. There are 3 versions of Ocarina of Time, most notable one being the first one that most people talk about. This one being called version 1.0. It includes 3 things that were cut from the 1.2 release, that being Ganon's blood being red, the Fire Temple having Islamic chanting, and the mirror shield, as well as some blocks that had the symbol on them changed. The new symbol would actually be used later on to represent the Gyuto in later games. Now, before I end this video, I would like to mention that somebody actually did get their hands on a developer cartridge for Space World 97 showing of Zelda 64. However, they cannot release the ROM due to copyright reasons, and even if he did, I assure you that both him and the cartridge would go missing in a couple days.